It's the Devy Digest powered by League Winners. I'm Andy, and we're talking C2C trading approach. I have a special guest today. We cover all this and more after the intro. What is going on? We have an exciting episode today. My guest today, he is part of the Devy Devotional Podcast. He is one of the Campus to Canton Devy analysts. He is one of the most knowledgeable people in the space. I am honored to be joined by Aaron Wilcox. Aaron, how you doing?
Andy, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's great to be on this Devy Digest podcast, and I think it's actually funny. I literally just thought about this, but I have my own Devy devotional podcast that I do, and there's other podcasts in this space like the Devy debate. All of them like that DD focus, right? So Devy Digest. This is awesome. I'm really excited to be on with you.
I appreciate you coming on talking C2C trading approach. Now, tell the people about yourself and how you got into content creation.
Yeah, so basically, and this is probably a very similar thing amongst a lot of people in this format, but started with Dynasty, or I mean, even before that, just the redraft, right? And then getting into Dynasty, then dipping my toes a little bit into the water of the Devy landscape in college, actually. So maybe like 2015, something like that. And then, I don't know, I think the biggest thing for me was evaluating prospects, these guys in college, like seeing what their NFL potentials could be. And I just got further deeper and deeper. And then pretty soon it's like I'm looking into these freshman guys. And that, I mean, there's just a lot of players out there to evaluate. And that naturally made me want to go into like the campus to Canton type of format as a league, as somebody who's now doing rankings and things like that. So that's kind of my path, just slowly getting more and more immersed in this landscape of players and those leagues. And then I just love every piece of it, like the trading components, that if there's free agency in a C2C league, it's all so much fun to me.
So from Devy to C2C, how long did it take you to transition into that? Because I know for a lot of people, Devy is that gateway drug to C2C.
Yeah, you're right. And I don't know exactly how many years, but it was definitely a few years before I wanted to take that jump. And to be honest, that I was even introduced to the format. Just I didn't even know it was out there for a while. And then it really started to gain popularity here in the last, I don't know, 3, 4 years or so. So I would say C2C specific, probably 3 to 4 years ago was when I first started getting into it. And I'm not one of those folks who's in like 40 different leagues or anything like that, but I definitely have my few that I really like to put time into and stay very active in. So really fun format. I would highly recommend it, and we'll talk all those things today. But yes, I absolutely love that C2C format.
Now, when you first got into Devy, what made you want to get into that jump? I know you mentioned, watching film on these freshman guys, but like, what was the main reason and why you want to get into Devy?
Yeah, and I've always been very passionate about Dynasty, and it would just seem like Dynasty on steroids, that type of thing, right? Just even more fun to it. I would say the one drawback that I have with maybe Devy is that then it really depletes the picks, so it makes those rookie drafts less fun. But you're at the end of the day getting these college drafts too. So I mean, I think there's a little give and take with that format, and with the campus again, it's just so much deeper on that college side, right? So at the end of the day, there's just a little different nuances. It's all personal preference, I guess, at the end of the day. But yeah, just loving the dynasty format and keeping these players year after year and building these powerhouses. That's one of the things that also drew me to the Devy landscape. Might as well start getting some of these great players earlier on, right before they make that NFL jump.
Now, let's go ahead and talk about the topic today that we are talking about. It's going to be C2C trading approach. Now, I know a lot of people when, they've asked me, when trading, like, do you do you find it more difficult to package these college players up to the NFL side, or do you find it easier because a lot of people feel like a certain college prospect might make that jump and you can kind of take advantage of that and kind of get these proven NFL assets? Like say for example, if you have like a Drake May or a Malik Neighbors right now on your campus side, are you going to try to trade up to the Canton side to get like a proven commodity like a Joe Burrow or a Puka Nakua? Or is your mindset where, if you really believe in someone, like if you really believe in Drake May, you're going to hold on to them and see what you have?
Yeah, that's a good question and a good point. If you really are a believer, like why would you want to get rid of them, right? But at the end of the day, that is just sometimes even more of a risky asset when a guy is a freshman or just, maybe 1, 2 years into the college career. You don't really know how things will evolve with their development, with injuries, with the fact that you don't know how the NFL will value them. And maybe they'll get into a situation like a Drake London, or I guess even like a Kyle Pitts or whoever the case is, where they don't maybe land in that perfect spot. And it just takes them so long to actually give you any return, any value. In a campus to Canton league, obviously different when you can score points on that college side. That's so valuable. But, just in general, the examples that you gave. So a couple guys now who are done with their collegiate career, we haven't seen them yet in the NFL. So like Drake May, Malik Neighbors, they still inherently have that risk because we haven't seen them hit and also get into a great spot at the NFL level yet. So at the end of the day, I am not opposed by any means. Even though I believe in those guys, I think that both of them are great players that you selected as examples. I'm not opposed by any means of saying, well, Joe Burrow, we've seen him be a stud, a very, very good player on the NFL side. Why not just try to um, insulate that risk a little bit by trading a Drake May, even if you had to add maybe a little bit to Joe Burrow to get a Joe Burrow? I think that may be worthwhile. And Puka Nakua, I mean, I guess you'll find some people who are split on him still. I think we all should say like at least he's a good wide receiver at the NFL level. It just depends if you think he's great or not. Because I mean, I think that one's even more interesting with Malik Neighbors being a very, very good wide receiver, like almost that Marvin Harrison Jr. type of awesome guy coming out. But yeah, do you have a specific thought or strategy along those lines of like, do you want that college guy coming out or do you want a little bit more safety, especially if you believe in the college guy?
For me, with the quarterback position, I'm always trying to trade up to someone that's already established. So, if I do have a Drake May, or if I do have a JJ McCarthy, or someone like that, that's possibly a quarterback 2, 3, 4 in this class, I'm always going to try to trade up and see if I can get someone that people are down on. Like someone that I'm trying to trade for this year is Trevor Lawrence because people are kind of down on him. He's had, this year was supposed to be his breakout year, and he kind of struggled. So, if a manager who has him is kind of, torn or they're kind of frustrated with him, if I can bait a Drake May or if I can bait a JJ McCarthy and get someone that's proven, I'm going to definitely do that. With the other positions, like a wide receiver, maybe maybe a running back, I don't know, but mainly for a wide receiver, if I can't get into a tier that I'm comfortable with for a proven NFL asset, I'll try to hang on to them, see what I have.
Yeah, that's extremely fair. And like you mentioned, you do want to get into something that's actually proven on the NFL side because you just don't want to take one kind of high probability dice roll for another kind of iffy one on the NFL side just because they're already on an NFL team or whatever the case is. So maybe like if you don't believe in, I'm just coming up with a random example, but like Nico Collins, right? If you think that he's more so a product of that situation and benefiting from thus far playing with CJ Stroud, but you don't know what the future holds. Like maybe you're just better off holding on to that Malik Neighbors, who's a tad younger, who really, really is an exciting prospect, more so than what Nico was coming out. So yeah, very interesting strategies that you can come up with there. And I don't know if there's necessarily a right or wrong answer, but of course we see those trades every once in a while where you're like, yeah, that's risky either side of that spectrum, I guess.
Now, if you're someone that has Nico Collins, are you trying to hang on to him or are you trying to sell high? Because, we've seen with Tank Dell and then possibly they might go out and get a veteran wide receiver. Are you going to try to hang on to him? Or are you going to try to trade him? And if so, are you going to try to get supplemental picks on the college side? Or what would you be trying to get if you have him?
So as far as return for Nico Collins, I would not necessarily be looking at supplemental picks just because similar to what we just talked about, you almost want a little bit more proven return for some of these players, right? When you're trading them away. I guess if you really think that Nico is just a poor player and you really want to solidify that future on the college side, like yes, you could go supplemental heavy, but I still like being able to get an NFL player back in that type of deal, not just trading Nico for a couple of random picks or lower tier or mid tier assets on the campus side. So I guess maybe a good example would be tiering down, and I don't necessarily have a guy on off the top of my head, but just saying like a Christian Kirk, trading Nico for a Christian Kirk plus some really nice supplemental picks or players, something like that might get it done and still gives you some years of hopefully nice production on the NFL level. And we know that there can be some volatility with a guy like Nico Collins long term. So you'll see guys really valued all over the place. So I would say a large part of that is your trade partner, right? What are they willing to do? Are they really into a guy like a Nico Collins? So first, that's what you have to gauge to see just if the juice is worth the squeeze. But that was an example of, tearing down, still retaining some NFL talent, getting supplementals. Um, that's a more interesting question if you would trade him straight up for maybe like a campus player who's maybe like an Evan Stewart or somebody like that who's unproven to this point. That's a tough scenario. And then that is something that I guess my podcast, Devy Devotional, has covered at one point this offseason was like, would you rather have these NFL guys or these college guys? And we kind of ranked them, but it's a tough exercise, I have to say.
Now, for the for the campus side, are you fairly aggressive? So, say for example, the first quarter of the season's done, and you're maybe 1-2, 1-3. Are you going to try to trade some of those assets? Maybe trade a a purely CFF guy to a contender to pick up supplemental picks? Are you trying to package them and get maybe a lesser Devy commodity asset? What's your approach on that campus side when when you know you're not a contender in the early part of the season?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you are truly out of contention, that's a little bit different than, of course, being mediocre to start and being kind of unsure what your future is. But if you're truly out of contention, I'm definitely trying to offload those guys unless they're having just the most elite of elite, G5 seasons, for example. If you got the CFF stud, and I'm not just talking about volume stats like, Marcus Carroll, he was getting great volume and great scoring for your campus squad. But at the end of the day, I don't think most people would anticipate him being a very good NFL player, right? He was just more so a product of the opportunity and system. And maybe he is going to be a good player. He's going to the P5 level this year to Missouri, and Marcus Carroll could be interesting there as well, but he needs that volume again. I'm a little bit skeptical that he can keep up that efficiency at a much tougher competition level. So at the end of the day, I am willing to trade those guys away, especially if you're out of contention. If you're still kind of, I could compete. You have to gauge the market. So this is somewhat league dependent as well. That's such an underrated part of this is that I mean, in some leagues, everybody's looking to sell those CFF guys. And if you can just land a few of them, you can go on a hot streak. You can get into your campus playoffs and you can really go off. And they're relatively cheap. And that's the issue with selling them, too, is that there's just a huge variety of suitors. There's some people who are like, no, I'll never send a mid to early supplemental pick for a college only, LeJonte Wester or Marcus Carroll, or you go down the list. There's a lot of CFF relevant guys. If somebody's asking a huge price tag, you can usually get one cheaper elsewhere. So that is why I'm like, I'm exploring that selling market. If you're truly out of contention, for sure, right? Sometimes you have to take a lesser return. And sometimes if you wait, you can get a better return in the season too. So trading them at some point, but understanding that, they might have value closer to playoffs. Depends if you have a trade deadline or not. I'm a big advocate of no trade deadline. I think it just adds a lot of fun to a league. But if you have a trade deadline, just be very aware of that and make sure you give yourself enough time to I guess shop these guys around and get fair return on them. Because at the end of the day, very low probability of these smaller school CFF studs truly making a big impact at the NFL level.
Now, kind of going off on a side note before we go back into the main topic, you're saying with the trade deadline, you prefer no trade deadline. I know that there are a couple of leagues where I have friends who are in, and they had league mates that went all in because there was no trade deadline. They went all in. They traded away all their supplemental picks to get CFF assets. They ended up winning the CFF side, and then they paid the fees for the very next year. But because the pot was bigger than what the fees were, they didn't care. They won the championship, and then they left, and then they had to fill that orphan, and that orphan team had no supplemental picks, and they were all CFF guys. Ha- you say that you're a fan of the no trade deadline. Have you seen anything similar to that in any of your leagues?
Yeah, if I experienced that in a league, that would definitely kind of sour maybe my opinion or at least that specific experience. And I have not ran into something like that. I think that's why it's so important to, when you get into a league, kind of get a feel for that kind of thing, right? Trust that the manager is a little bit like picking guys who maybe are committed and really excited about the format and not just dipping out and only so money hungry base that they're willing to just ruin these teams. But unfortunately, you see it, right? You can't always predict these things or see it coming. And that is the downside. But what was to stop those guys from going all in maybe right before the deadline, too? Like they could have done the same exact thing, kind of rolled the dice a little bit more. Like you know, I guess no guarantees that they would have made it to the championship and made all that money, but I do think that you could say that people can still ruin their teams in a huge variety of other ways, even if there is a trade deadline present. So at the end of the day, I like how fun that is for playoff teams to be able to load up, and you know what, it does help these teams that are kind of middling or maybe trying to rebuild, right? They can offload their guys like a Marcus Carroll, or you go down the list of these CFF guys who are maybe expiring assets. I think it's so great for those lower tier teams to be able to trade and offload them and actually get something for them down the stretch of the season. But that assumes like an active league, right? Because sometimes inactivity for those teams that are falling out of contention, that can be an issue too. So sometimes the rich get richer and the
Yeah.
poor stay poor, right? But that can happen again with or without a trade deadline, in my opinion.
Now, for me personally, I'm pretty aggressive as far as the campus side goes. If after the first 4 weeks, if I'm 0-4 or 1-3, I am going to sell my assets. Like last year, I was able to set the market. I traded San Jose State's quarterback Chevron Cordero. I got him, or I traded him and got a fifth round supplemental pick, and I was able to set that market, and then I was able to kind of use that fifth to trade other players for that. So for me, I'm fairly aggressive just because I want to set that market. I want to say, okay, I want to trade this guy for this guy. And once I have that as evidence, like I could be like, I could go to another contender and be like, hey, I just traded this quarterback for a fifth. I have this player right here. He's probably just as good, if not better. So I want another fifth. And then, that's kind of my approach when I'm not contending. Like for you, do you try to be aggressive like that to try to set that market in your leagues?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and that's something I've become a little bit more complacent with over the last year. But it is nice to be able to be the first one to make that move, right? So I would say that when I first got into the format, I was even more aggressive than maybe what I am right now, but I'm still very willing to reach out and just kind of out of the blue and be like, yes, are you interested in making this trade and trying to be first to the market, I guess you're saying? And yeah, if you can set that market, there is value in that. I know that it's a double-edged sword at times, like, you use that in negotiations, and they're like, "Yeah, well, somebody else paid that, but they might not be very smart. I'm not doing that kinda thing. Good luck." It doesn't necessarily always work, but it works for some, right? They see that, okay, there is, at least some precedent already made for that kinda move, and they're maybe less afraid to work with you. So, there's a lot to be said about being pretty aggressive in trade offers and negotiations. And I think how you navigate things in life in general, but also in Devy in campus to Cadden leagues, how you navigate those trade conversations is important too, because there's just such a wide variety of valuation on the college side. And then there's that wrinkle of there's an NFL side to your teams as well. Like there's a lot of wiggle room for you to maybe hash out a deal and get creative. It's nice to keep an open mind and not turn negotiations hostile, I guess, or whatever the case might be. Just because even though they turned you down, just flat up, no, I don't want to do that. Maybe they'd be willing to do something either similar or a slightly different idea to it, involving those same players. So again, that's maybe another testament to the fun of this format as a whole. But again, I do like being somewhat aggressive for sure and being flexible as a trade partner.
I think a lot of times managers will just send out just a blind offer with no context behind it. What I like to do is if there's a player I'm targeting or if there's a manager that is out of it in either side of the campus to Canton format, what I personally do is I'll send a DM first. I'll be, hey, what's your thought process? Which players are you kind of wanting to offload to kind of retool your team for the following years? And I think by doing it that way, you can kind of build that rapport early on instead of just sending that blank trade offer. And I know a lot of people can get offended if you just send a blank offer. I want this guy for this guy, and they're like, is this guy trying to pull the wool over me? What is he doing? So when you're looking at trading and you're saying to build that rapport with your league mates, what is your approach when you try to trade on either side of the format?
I also like that DM method, or at least just sending maybe a little bit of context to that offer. You don't necessarily have to lead with the DM first before you throw out the offer. Sometimes you can just even start that conversation. First things first, you should probably know your teammate, or if it's a new league, I guess you don't really have much to go off of. But if you know your league mates and there's somebody who's willing to have a conversation with you and you've had good terms before, that is great to again throw that dialogue out there to not maybe sour your relationship or your negotiations, just to say, hey, I see that this might be a little bit more of a rebuilding year. If you're open to that, I have, X, Y, and Z, and I'd be interested in maybe your X, Y, and Z. Just throwing out an idea like that, that you can build off of is valuable. I think it's important to have an idea in mind of specifically what you want out of that message, though, because you sometimes throw out those things, be like, "Hey, would you be willing to deal Malik Neighbors?" And then it's like the conversation from there is just there's no direction to it, and that's hard to do. So I think that the DM, if you are respectful and giving maybe a little bit of context around the ideas that you have or the offer you have, maybe can start a good conversation. Just have an idea of what you want out of this deal, and maybe if they if you could mutually make that work. But yeah, the DM is good. The cold offers, I mean, they'll work for some people. So certainly you could consider that if there's somebody who doesn't like to talk, you just got to throw some bunch of offers out there, maybe spam them with a couple, maybe not excessive, like 20 offers, right? But a few. I think that's a valid route as well, especially if you know their style.
Now, I know that in one of my leagues last year, I was trying to go all in. I was trying to buy CFF assets, and a manager had LeJohntay Wester. And earlier, we were talking about Marcus Carroll, LeJohntay Wester, all these, G5 CFF assets that, played great and was putting up numbers. And I was, talking back and forth with the manager, and the manager was like, I want to use this player to retool next year with my sup picks. Well, lo and behold, the portal and all these guys are transferring up to the power four. For you, how do you value the portal with these CFF guys? Are you treating them more like redraft kind of players where I can't bank on this guy being here next year? If I'm out of it, I'm gonna try to get peak value. So, we can talk about those players that have already moved, and we can talk possibly about like a Caden Salter at Liberty. He kind of dipped into the portal this year, but when he dipped in, it was too late. All of the Power Four schools had already taken their quarterback, so he didn't really have a home that he could transfer up to. He ends up, coming back to Liberty, but there's nothing to say that he might not do it again next year. So how are you treating these CFF guys in this kind of portal format?
Yeah, in most cases, I do treat them as kind of a year-to-year proposition, year-to-year situation that could wildly fluctuate and change. So it's definitely not a like how it used to be. Maybe you get 3-4 years of just CFF gold from a guy. I'm trying to think of like Rasheen Ali, right? You don't see that all the time. And I know there was injury, unfortunately, that kind of derailed that middle part of his career. But yeah, it's so fun to see those guys stick with those teams year after year, but that's just not the reality anymore. So we kind of have to change that strategy up a little bit and say, well, there's so much fluidity with the transfer portal and changes that can make. So maybe it's not even the wide receiver that you roster that moves schools, but it's like the coach and the quarterback and all these other guys could transfer too. So I don't like to get too, I guess, not falling in love with these CFF only type guys, the top end producers. Instead, more so treating them as like year to year assets that, if they're young, yeah, maybe they'll have an opportunity to also be successful in the future. But if they transfer, and usually they like to transfer up in competition, unless they're really special, right? They're doing something really um, efficient as a runner or something at a really high level as a wide receiver, I'm a little bit skeptical of them actually having a lot of value that next year when they transfer up to like a P4, a high end school. So there's always exceptions to that, but for the most part, it is kind of risky valuing those guys. But how about you, Andy? Do you have any specific, I guess, thoughts on how you can navigate that nowadays?
I'll treat them as redraft guys. So for me, if I'm trying to target someone that is a quote unquote CFF guy, for me, I want to see if they have any traits that can possibly turn into a Devy asset. If there's any underlying traits that I can possibly see if they transfer up to a power four, if they can kind of hold some value. But if not, I'm treating them as if I would treat a redraft league where I'm only going to have this guy for 1 year. So if I'm not in contention, if it's looking to be a heavy CFF side where there's 4 or 5 teams that appear to be in it, and I'm on the borderline, I am going to eject and bounce and try to field offers from those CFF heavy dynasty teams on the C2C side and see what I can get, just because how volatile it is. Last year with Jonte Wester, he won a lot of people championships. At one point he had, I believe it was around a 40% target share. So he was, going crazy. And, you can't rely on that because this year he's at Colorado. He might be borderline not rosterable. I know Marcus Carroll is borderline not rosterable with all the guys Missouri has brought in on the running back side. So yeah, for me with the portal, I think it adds an extra element in C2C leagues that makes it even more fun because you can be so aggressive and make all these moves, and it can work out for both sides. If you're trying to rebuild, you can get supplemental picks, and if you're trying to win a championship, LeJontay Wester did that for you, and it is worth giving up maybe a third or fourth round supplemental pick because you won a championship because of that, and now you might not have a usable asset, but you won the league last year.
Yeah, I think all that is fair. And I guess one thing to also consider too is that, like you said, adding a guy like a LeJontay Wester and Marcus Carroll, just because those are the names that we've been using, who still have some eligibility in college. But there's quite a few other guys like Ricky White I don't know. But you see those guys and they might be really tempting to add to your roster, but then think, do you really need them is another question when you need to evaluate, like, what is your starting lineup going to be in the playoffs? And assuming you're a playoff team, what is that lineup going to look like? Are you, basically like maybe getting only like a 1 or 2 point advantage by adding this guy, or are you truly just that depleted, injuries or just thin on depth, whatever the case is, that you absolutely need them as a starter? So that's something that I looked at this year a little bit and trying to, I guess, weigh if it's necessary to even make those moves. Or maybe you're a playoff contender and you're so deep that you're additionally trying to trade those guys away because you're like, well, he's good depth, but like long term, it's a CFF only guy. So, like you said, there's a lot of different ways in this format to create value, to extract value maybe from these players, or to maybe invest in them just as like a 1 year type of rental with upside for an additional year as well.
And then sometimes what you think is a 1 year rental might be two. Because I know for me, KJ Jefferson and Taj Brooks were guys that I traded for. KJ Jefferson didn't work out, but Taj Brooks did. But I didn't know Taj Brooks had more than last year. I didn't know he had another year of eligibility, and the manager that traded him didn't know either. So sometimes what you think is a 1 year that you're trading for might possibly turn into multiple years. So the eligibility that is just a mystery. It can sometimes work in your favor, and sometimes it's works against you.
Yeah, no, good point. Or like another guy like RJ Harvey, UCF back, right? I mean, who kind of really
Hmm.
started to pop off last year. And I guess he's coming back for what, a 6 year? He's in at least going to be a 6 year here. So, yeah, these guys can stick around. Yeah, that makes it interesting. That's for sure. But it's a gamble. We talked about it. It's like understanding that nothing's guaranteed next year with these guys is just so important. So, yeah, at the end of the day, I don't mind it as long as you're not overextending yourself risk wise or you're not sending way too much. And again, evaluating your league landscape. So maybe you can get somebody who's comparable but cheaper from somebody else. It's certainly worth trying to put in a little bit of work just to see what those prices are out there in your leagues.
Now, with these freshmen that are wide receivers, we know about the year 1-0 with Campus to Canton. If Let's just go for an example. Brandon Innes, last year he was pretty close to it. There was possibilities if Ohio State didn't make the playoffs that, Marvin Harrison, Emeka Egbuka, they might opt out and Brandon Innes might meet the year one, threshold. He ended up not doing it. A couple other guys were close, like Malachi Coleman, Hakeem Williams. And then you have certain guys that didn't even see the field, like Jurion Dickey. If you're taking these high profile wide receivers in your sub drafts and midway through the season they're looking like it's not going to pan out, they might not have a pathway to playing time, they're in the SEC conference play or they're in the Big Ten conference play, and you're done with those blowout games. How do you treat those guys that are borderline making that year 1 0 threshold? Like, are you trying to offload them? Are you going to try to hang on to them? What's your process with those guys?
Yeah, for the most part, I mean, you're taking what you can get with some of the lower tier guys, like the maybe the Jalen Browns. He was an LSU guy, right? Who is a little, I mean, he was still a solid recruit for sure. And then you kind of go down the list of like, they didn't do anything. Um, I'm trying to even think of other examples, but let's go higher tier guys that you mentioned that just didn't really do a whole lot. Jurian Dickey, or you can throw a Shelton Sampson, LSU there, Noah Rogers, Ohio State. And for the most part, if you really liked those guys and believed in those guys coming out, chances are you're not going to want to just release them, right? You're going to want to see what happens there, hold them for another year. And typically that's what you have to do is you just have to hold those guys if you really believe in them. I think you and I talked pre-show, like Aaron Anderson was the guy for you, right? From Bama to LSU, where it's like, well, nobody was really giving you much, so you kind of had to hold them. And then now it's like, well, 2 years later, what do you do with these guys? So if they haven't given you 2 years, I mean, that's usually a pretty good sign. It might not work out at that level. Unless they transfer again, right? But I think that with these guys where they were just really blocked, like Shelton Sampson. I mean, blocked by two really good wide receivers this year at LSU, and they didn't really go super deep into their wide receiver core and try to play these freshmen very often. Or you could look at like Noah Rogers, and it's like only so many guys could get on the field ahead of Emeka Egbuka, who was injured, but then Marvin Harrison Jr. and some of the other guys there, including Carnell Tate, a very, very talented wide receiver as well. So I don't give up on the guys who maybe have been blocked for more understandable circumstances. But if the depth chart's wide open, or at least not that jam packed, I think even Hakeem Williams, I would have expected him to do a little bit more. I was not super high on him, and I really do think he's a guy you got to move off of. I guess your question was also like what do you do with it? Like how much are you willing to sell low on them for? And that's a complicated question, but at least seeing what your options are in the leagues and seeing if somebody's like, yeah, I'll give you a mid-round supplemental pick. It's like, great. Maybe it is time to move off unless you hear some really, really great hype this time of year about them or something.
We were talking about with the portal, with these year 1 0 guys that have transferred out. You have Noah Rogers from Ohio State to NC State, and you have Jalen Brown from LSU to Florida State. With the portal and how it is now, and with those two guys as reference points, are you going to hang on to them a little bit longer just because they're in a different environment? And like you said, those were two guys that were blocked.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's a interesting application of like the year 1 0 theory is like that was a lot of data from pre ability to transfer out, right? And really make a name for yourself with a new quarterback, new coaching staff, maybe new situation. Maybe you're not close to bad influences or whatever the case is, I guess, for these kids who just don't make it work for one reason or another. I really do like the idea of some of these really high end guys maybe getting another chance. Again, when it was more of the situation that didn't allow them onto the field. And it's always hard to parse that out, right? Did Noah Rogers just not get onto the field because he's trash or he's just not a good player? Or is it truly because it was that talented of a wide receiver room and they could only play so many freshmen? And you ran into that even with Brandon Innes. But Noah Rogers is actually getting out of there, actually going to somewhere that should have an up and coming offense at NC State. I think that Noah Rogers is somebody that I'm still somewhat excited about, and I'm holding him if I have him, just because I know the general consensus is to give up on these guys who kind of flopped, didn't really get an opportunity. But there were a lot of signs there that Noah Rogers, as a recruit and in the spring practices, was really good and he was impressing, but obviously not to the degree that allowed him to make an impact last year. So ultimately, a big value drop for those guys, and that's some of the risk that you take on when you draft these freshmen who just have never proven anything before, right?
I want to say it was about 6 weeks ago, you had made a post on X about year 1 0s and who you would consider to buy or sell. Who the players that didn't meet the year 1 0 threshold, which players would you buy, you know, at fair cost when you made that post? Who are a couple that you would want to possibly gamble on?
Yeah, at this point, I think that Brandon Innes has likely retained enough value where I'm not sure if I'm paying up for him. But I mean, once you get into those mid rounds of supplemental picks, I mean, again, I just laid out some of the reasons for why Ohio State was just so hard to play a significant role on this last season, and I think that he's still a fair one. Who technically didn't hit those thresholds. Jurian Dickey is a little bit more risky. I'm not really considering him like a prime buy candidate. I'm assuming that the people who drafted him for good reason, right? I mean, I liked the flashes that I saw in high school and some of the production, but injury didn't really allow him to see the field last year. Some of the guys who have broken the year 1-0 method in the past, like DK Metcalf, it's just injury related and not necessarily skill or other things like that. And sometimes it is competition related, not being able to get on the field just because of great teammates. So again, guys who are maybe meeting those criteria, Shelton Sampson, LSU wide receiver, Brandon Innes, Ohio State wide receiver, Noah Rogers, Ohio State wide receiver. And then after that, it starts getting a little bit more hairy. I wouldn't really advocate buying those rest of those guys, like a DeAndre Moore Jr., Texas. I liked him, but you see how loaded Texas is now. I just think it's done for him at Texas. Like, I'd be surprised if he sticks around, and if he does, I don't think that's going to be a very fruitful situation for him, unfortunately. So you go down to those lower tier guys, if they were already kind of like a borderline 4-star recruit, and then they just didn't do anything year one, and there wasn't a great reason for it, and that's a red flag.
Now, earlier we were talking about, trade partners and, sending DMs and, trying to figure out, the best kind of a deal. If you're trying to make a trade and it's kind of stalling, are you trying to use those college sub picks as a sweetener to try to add them in, or are you trying to hold those?
I am one of those guys where I look at my draft board in these supplemental drafts and it's just all over the place. Like, you see the ones that are neat, right? They never trade a pick. And down the whole row, they are just, yep, they're always at the 105 or whatever the case is. Mine are all over the place because I am trying to move those picks. So it's kind of like a wild draft strategy. I know people who have been in leagues with me will maybe appreciate this, but it's just sometimes like a chaos, like the NFL draft, right? When everybody's scrambling to make calls and like, who are we going to, are we going to trade up here? Are we going to do this and that? Who are we going to pick? They're going to slide. Are they going to get taken? And there's a little bit of that with my drafting strategy. But at the end of the day, I like to think that, while there's a little bit of chaos going on, it's all for a good reason. It's because I'm not too attached to the idea of like, well, I really want to be at the 305 pick here. It's like, well, if I want my guy, I am going to try to make some swaps, whether that's during the draft, right before, in the off season, whenever. And if you are during your season, I'm not afraid to move some of those picks. And I get it. It's like, it's easy to move something in the future. And then once the future comes around, you're like, wow, my draft kind of sucks. I don't have a lot of those prime picks. I've been in both situations before, but I generally tend towards, again, trying to get more established players. We led off the show tonight with some ideas of trading these guys who are in college for maybe more established, NFL picks. An example that I'm did this last year is I traded a few guys on the campus side, and I can't remember if there was anybody else bigger involved in this deal, but it was basically like Jalen Milroe and Bucky Irving, and maybe it was like a pick or a solid player for Kyler Murray. It was like, I really wanted to get a stud on the NFL side, and I wasn't afraid to, trade some guys that I liked somewhat on the campus side, or picks, things like that. But at the end of the day, it's all for, bettering or getting something very much worthwhile in return. So for sure, supplemental picks are all fair game for me to move. I don't advocate for getting too attached to those by any means, because you can always get them later in various different ways if you really have a guy you want.
And that trade with, Kyler Murray for Jalen Moreau and Bucky Irving, it worked out for both sides. I mean, the manager that had Kyler Murray, he was probably frustrated. He or she was probably frustrated and wanted to start fresh and got Jalen Moreau and got Bucky Irving. And Bucky Irving, some people are hyping up as a top three running back in this class. So, there are times where there is no clear cut winner or loser in a trade. Both side wins, and I think people have this mindset where it's like they have to win the trade. They have to win the trade. They're afraid to look bad, but trade values, it changes weekly and monthly. What looks like a win now is going to be a loss later, and vice versa. So I think a lot of players need, or a lot of managers, they need to know that these trade values, in 6 months from now, it's going to be a lot different from what it is right now, and be more flexible.
Absolutely. And now that I was kind of curious. I'm like, what exactly were the details of this trade? And there was even like Isaiah Bond involved in it. So I actually
Okay.
got Isaiah Bond back, but then I also gave up Jalen Wright as well, who's another, like you
Mm-hmm.
said, Bucky Irving is a guy who's for some has been either a riser or just at least pretty highly regarded in this draft class. And same with Jalen Wright out of
Yeah.
Tennessee. Like he is potentially a top five back in this rookie class coming out. So there's different layers. And like you said, values fluctuate wildly. Because when I bought Isaiah Bond, he was a little bit of like a downward trajectory, like not really making a huge impact at Alabama. And Alabama was struggling to throw the ball and to really establish much consistency with the passing game. And then now he ends up at Texas. And I think most people really like that landing spot and his potential now. So his value has made kind of a big swing back up. So yeah, it's a volatile landscape out there, but it makes it fun.
Now let's talk some more on Isaiah Bond. He goes into Texas. Isaiah Bond, Matthew Golden. You have Jonte Cook, and then you have you know I guess Ryan Wingo. I'm not a big fan of his, but Ryan Wingo's there. What's your evaluation of that Texas room? I mean, I know we're talking trade assets here, but like, what's your evaluation of that Texas receiving room? Who do you think is a buy in that room, and who do you think is a sell in that room? As far as the entire complexity goes, from a Devy asset to a CFF, kind of production. What's your overall take of that room?
Yeah, I do think that I guess my overall take is that those guys will probably eat into a little bit of each other for sure, and a lot of talent coming in there. I still think that Matthew Golden is a little bit more on the sell side. Isaiah Bond, probably more of that hold, like he, or even, I mean, you could sell him if people are really obsessed with his prospects of being like the alpha in that room. Just because you look at Jonte Cook and he was such a good recruit and he actually got on the field even with all the talent there. People are talking about AD Mitchell being a quality wide receiver in this class. Obviously, Xavier Worthy is, I believe in him more so, but I think he's a great wide receiver, or at least a very good wide receiver as well. And those guys are now leaving. There is that opportunity there, and Jonte Cook even made somewhat of an impact this year with the talent there and the depth there too. So at the end of the day, Cook might cannibalize a little bit of what Isaiah Bond is looking to achieve there. But at the end of the day, I think that those two guys will be on top. Matthew Golden is no slouch, but I do think that he'll be kind of that third fiddle. And it will make it really difficult for those freshman wide receivers like a Ryan Wingo coming in. I think he's going to have a hard time carving out much of a role besides a little gadgety role here or there. Maybe they'll get him involved out of the backfield a little bit or in the return game. But I think like an Aaron Butler to Texas as well. Like I really like him. I like him even more than Wingo, and I still don't really see like a huge role for Aaron Butler year one. Maybe we're seeing the same thing that we've seen at Ohio State, where these young guys may not even get an opportunity to get on the field as freshmen, and they're not necessarily big time sells either. Just because of all the talent that's accumulated there, we got to take that into consideration as well in that Texas wide receiver room. That maybe Aaron Butler and Wingo are not terrible players, but they couldn't compete with all of the top end depth at Texas right now. So I guess that's my take with it. But do you have any differing opinions on that Texas wide receiver situation?
I was always a Jonte Cook guy. I was trying to get him anywhere I could last year, and I like Jonte Cook. I My thing with him is Silas Bolden will come in and operate out of the slot, and I think I think Texas released an early depth chart, and Jonte Cook was not listed as a starter, but Silas Bolden was. So for me, with Texas bringing all these guys, I think it is a concern. I think at the end of the day, the guy to buy is going to be Isaiah Bond, just because he was able to show his flashes at Alabama. The guy to sell for me is definitely Matthew Golden. I think Matthew Golden, he might end up being one of those guys that just runs gassers all day. He's running that deep route to kind of clear out space, to have Bond kind of work the intermediate in the middle area, and then Silas Bolden could also be that guy to run gassers, but if he's operating out of the slot, probably the short to intermediate area, and then they also bring in Amari Nyblack. So I think Jonte Cook, I am afraid that he might get left out, but he did really well last year, as a true freshman, and so I think it's a very interesting room. I personally wouldn't buy any of them, but if I had to pick one, it would be Isaiah Bond.
Yeah, I don't mind that call at all. I mean, I think Isaiah Bond has a lot of the chops that you're looking for and that experience and this and that. I do hesitate to really buy too much into the Bolden depth chart situation right now, just because I identify Jonte Cook as that superior talent at this time. And the way to get Bolden to commit to them may have been saying, yep, you're going to get this, starting role. You're going to get a shot at that right away. And then he might end up just being that depth guy at the end of the day, and Jonte Cook really takes over. I think there's going to be some sort of a big role there for Cook, and I also think that you bring up a good point. It might come at the expense of a Matthew Golden, who might be out there for maybe a fair amount of snaps, but running gasser is not the priority first or second read. So I think what Jonte Cook has done, I think, should make us at least feel quite optimistic that he is in that maybe that tier 2 of that class, right? We like Zachariah Branch and maybe Carnell Tate. I mean, people are really convinced that Carnell Tate is great at this point. I think there's a good chance he is a very good wide receiver as well. And then they're kind of unsure like who to slot in after that. Like, is it a big tier break and is Jonte Cook next? What is the case? And you illustrated well the risk that is there. But at the end of the day, I'm still a Cook fan. I'm not going to panic too much by that Silas transfer.
Yeah, and then as far as trying to acquire Devy guys, say for example, Quinshawn Judkins or Evan Stewart or Tet or Luther Burden, like these higher value Devy assets. Are you trying, or is it in your background or in your DNA to try to aggressively trade for them and see what you can get? And if so, how aggressive are you trying to be to try to get a quote unquote your guy that you don't have but you really believe in?
That is a good question. When I really believe in a player, I don't know. I still, even if I believe in them, is really so dependent on what the other manager is willing to give up, right? What they're willing to work with you on. Because I've been in those situations where it's like, I really want Tet McMillan. Like he's a stud. He probably, well, he has a good claim to being the wide receiver one actually in this upcoming year's draft class, right? But at the end of the day, if the guy's not willing to work with you and there's just nothing that they want on your end and nothing you can really offer them to make it work, it's not going to happen. So when I really want those guys, I will try to get creative. We talked earlier about ways to do that, implementing picks, implementing maybe multiple assets, or asking them, right, trying to start that dialogue, asking them, what sparks your interest? I guess what would help move this thing along. But sometimes you get shut down. At the end of the day, it is always risky going all in on these college guys, even if you believe a lot. Like I like to diversify shares a little bit. I don't necessarily have a spreadsheet in them saying once I get above 50%, then I can't do that. I can't have that much exposure. But I will say that it's really risky to roster a guy in 100% or 80% of your leagues or anything like that. So I'll say, as much as I like these guys, I will trade away, even if I believe in them a good amount. if the exposure is too high, and I think that there's some risk attached with them. So does that kind of answer your question there?
Yeah. Um, Between Evan Stewart, Luther Burden, and Tet, who are you highest of the three, and who are you lowest of the three, and why?
Yeah, I would say that I am highest on Tet McMillan. Tet, he has just been able to ball out regardless of the circumstance, competition, and do it winning downfield, but also impressing in just aspects of his game where you think he's just this big contested catch wide receiver. He is good in that role, but he has ability to separate, to win deep and gain some deep separation. And I don't think that his movement skills would necessarily disqualify him from being a versatile wide receiver at the next level. I'm not saying a guy at that size is going to be a slot only type of guy, but I think that Ted McMillan can kind of do it all. And he's really proven it to this point that he has that high end skill set that, Luther Burden, he's definitely taken a nice step forwards, but I would say I'm probably the lowest on him. I mean, Evan Stewart too, there's like maybe that injury concern. It's like, is the guy going to be able to fully put it together? It's going to be a huge red flag if he just doesn't really ball out this year. I guess changing teams and all that, but there's also risk with Luther Burden. So I struggle with I like all those guys. None of Burden or Stewart should be like priority, like panic sells by any means. But I think Burden's game is a little bit raw to this point as well. He really needs to take that. I mean, continue to develop there. But at least we saw him win deep more often this season, which was nice to see at Missouri. Thank you, Brady Cook, for being a competent wide receiver or a competent quarterback. So what wide receiver like Luther Burden could start to stick out a little bit more as well.
Now, with the C2C formats, typically a super flex on the NFL side, and on the college sides, it's anywhere from 2 to 4 quarterbacks aside. If someone is weak at the quarterback position on the NFL side and they can't, for whatever reason, make a trade to get something that they can have a viable asset on the NFL side, and if they need a quarterback for the 2025 class, who would you recommend that quarterback be?
If you're putting me on the spot as like you have to pick somebody, right? Because I would say maybe let's not rely on 2025 as like the future of your NFL squad. But I mean that's a tough one. I still like Wigman. Wigman's awesome, and I just was wishing that his season did not get cut short. That was a huge bummer, and I guess with some new changes going on there, I don't necessarily think that's going to be a bad thing for him. But the small sample that we saw could be a little bit misleading. But I liked all the things that he showed as a prospect coming out of high school. I liked his flashes as a freshman, and then especially as a second-year player. Wigman just offers a lot as far as his arm strength, size, his impressive production thus far. And yeah, I mean, he brings a lot of great things to the table, but there's risk there. So I'll be very honest and say that's the same thing with the guys in this class, this 2025 quarterback class. It is risky to invest in any of them. So I mean, I could see some arguments being made even for Jackson Dart being kind of a safe and sneaky guy to want to invest in for a cheaper price, right? And hopefully he becomes a nice asset for you at the NFL side, but still, even that's risky at this time. It's not a guarantee. So if you're looking for guarantees, might have to go elsewhere.
How do you like to have your roster built? Are you someone that is just going to go best player available, or are you trying to get the most talent at a certain position and try to have like for me, I will try to overflow my wide receiver bucket and have so much potential there and so much value there that I'll try to trade for a running back just because, with the running backs, they're being, devalued at the NFL level. And to a certain extent in the college side, we've seen, Raheem Sanders, his value took a dip. And then now you have Quinshawn and Travion on the same team. And, certain people might be down on them. What is your build usually like? And do you try to fill it with trades?
Yeah, it's difficult for me to point out one specific build strategy that always works or has consistently been like the answer. So, as a general rule of thumb, that running back position can be so volatile, and you're right, the situation can change huge for these guys. If you can find some really, really high end Devy upside NFL potential in those running backs, I definitely like to hammer that out and maybe sprinkle a few like CFF only guys in there, but really trying to just hammer out Devy talent regardless of the position is huge, especially in the early to mid rounds of a startup, but even in the supplemental. It's hard when you mix a lot of freshmen in there because there could be a lot of risk and a lot of misses with that strategy. But still, it's important to have a little bit of youth to your roster and maybe taking those riskier assets, we'll say, in those freshmen who could really turn out to be big time assets, big time producers for you for multiple years. And then the NFL side, that's huge. So sometimes you do have to go that rookie route, but positionally, I'm not super biased towards one way or another. You can find quality players deeper down into drafts most years. For example, this year, like there's a lot of quality running back depth to the Devy landscape, the campus side, and you can wait a little bit. I mean, I don't mind grabbing a higher end guy, but then even just you wait till the top 20 running backs are off the board and there's still a lot of talent there, right? And NFL worthy talent. So at the running back position, it does change year to year, I will say. And so that's going to affect your year to year strategy as a drafter, right? The campus pool has a dramatic impact on how I'm drafting.
I know earlier you said, when you're trading like a Nico Collins, you want, something that's still somewhat proven on the NFL side, on the Canton side, to try to still get your points and try to win. If you have guys that are quote unquote near that age cliff, like say for example Mike Evans, Stephon Diggs, Saquon, maybe guys who are already at the cliff, like a Keenan Allen, those kind of aging assets. If you're not contending and not winning trying to get a championship, are you more lenient on just trying to get maybe any kind of production, even if it's on the campus side, or maybe just get a supplemental pick? So what are you doing with those aging assets?
Yeah, and that's the age old question. I'm more likely to trade those guys early on, right? Even before maybe they drop off fully on that cliff. It's just a never ending, like, is this guy gonna like finally peter out after, balling for this many years? And you hate to sell early because Mike Evans had a great year. That was a
Yeah.
great player to bring up as an example. I think at this point, I mean, especially 30-year-old wide receivers, it's not something I'm looking to heavily invest in. So I'm gauging that market. We've talked about just throwing feelers out there, and in those campus academy leagues, you just never know if a guy's like, I kind of just need another flex wide receiver out there. Maybe I will take a shot on Mike Evans, and then you can hash out a supplemental deal pick. If you can get a pretty rich return, I'm not usually looking for like a mid-round pick or anything like that for somebody who still has good value on the NFL side, like Mike Evans or Amari Cooper or something like that. I need more. But if somebody starts throwing out like I could do a first plus we can make some other swap happen or something else that's worth your while, then my ears start perking up and I take a look to see if I can sustain that kind of a loss from my NFL side, or if I just want to roll the dice and let that guy just die on my roster, basically, like just try to squeeze that lemon until there's just nothing left. Because we know that some of these high end wide receivers, especially like running backs, a little different where it falls off at the NFL level, but just high end talent in general lasts for years and years and years. So I've unfortunately for years just never really wanted to invest in Travis Kelce because I know, he's going to fall off this year at 30 years old. I'm 31. And then now it's like, wow, all those years you kind of miss out on that production just by thinking, you're smart in getting out on time. So it can backfire, but for the most part, I'm evaluating to see if I can get that high end return from like a supplemental or a Devy asset return for those guys. Otherwise, I'm probably not selling it for a bunch of like depth that likely won't amount to much.
One player that's probably the riskiest this offseason until draft time is Justin Fields. If if you're someone that has a Justin Fields, are you trying to hang on and see if he ends up maybe with the Falcons and see what happens there? Or are you trying to potentially get off him? And if you can get maybe like a, Arch Manning, um, maybe you might have to package, Justin Fields and a couple of players for like Arch Manning and like maybe an aging asset like Aaron Rodgers. What are you doing with that?
That's a great question, and it really hinges on if you're able to get another quarterback who could give you one, well, usually more than 1 year of production, even if it is Aaron Rodgers. Sorry, my dog. But at the end of the day, yeah, it depends on that return that you're going to be able to get. So it's really it's a tough call. I would say that Aaron Rodgers plus Arch would not get it done for me. Definitely, like Justin Fields is just not going to be what I want to. I'm not going to want to get out from Justin Fields for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, for the trading approach, what has been, something that you have found to be successful? Is it more on packaging 3 to 4 campus side players for that Canton asset? Or do you find it easier just to trade within those leagues? Trade a campus player for a campus player, trade a Canton player for a Canton player. What's been your experience?
My experience, I do like to trade a little bit more on the campus side, so more of those college players, and then just trying to solidify my position on the NFL side. There's been situations where I can go back and forth with that strategy, though, because feeling out those league mates, feeling out the opportunities in your league is just so important. So at the end of the day, solidifying that NFL side, that usually lasts so much longer than these campus assets who tend to burn out, even if they're a pretty good prospect. That leads me to want to go a little bit heavier to the NFL side. And I know that's been somewhat of a theme, but that just holds true. Yeah, absolutely.
If you're in a league where the pot is pretty close to being 50-50, maybe it might be 55-45, in favor of the NFL side. But if the college side is somewhat comparable, are you willing to, you know, go all in on the campus side and not worry so much about the Canton side and being as strong on the Canton side? Like, I know a lot of people, I mean, the goal is to win both sides. That's the goal. But in leagues where the pot is divvied up pretty closely, what's your approach with that? And then from there, to go along with that, your trading approach with that then.
Yeah. In general, I do not like the just load up on the college players campus side and then really have a poor NFL side, just because we know that hit rates and injuries and all these other things, that the attrition of these Devy assets going over to the NFL side just doesn't really allow you to eventually be like an NFL powerhouse in most cases. You can see those extreme examples of people who can make that work, but typically they have some NFL talent already. And when you completely deplete yourself on the NFL side and let's say a startup, that puts you just at such a disadvantage for years that you may never be able to come back from that. And it doesn't even guarantee you a ship on the campus side either, because we know that campus side can be volatile, and we know that there's a lot of players that can emerge CFF only options in the landscape that you can land later in your drafts, middle rounds of your drafts, or some of your studs can pop too. So at the end of the day, I don't like to go too crazy on the campus side. I like to have a competitive roster, some balance to it. There's a lot of value in that, but I've never been somebody to, and I haven't really seen a lot of success with those cases where they overload the campus side and really neglect and trade away a lot of their NFL assets. It's a fun strategy, I think, for a lot to have that beast of a team on the Devy or campus side. That is so I guess fun, but we don't always play this for fun, right? We want to win. Maybe it's not for the money, right? That's a big part of the reason that I play is just I enjoy it. And the money is also a nice boost on top, though, right? The championships kind of live on forever, or at least like you remember, yes, I was the first champion of that league, whatever the case is. It's important ultimately to try to win and have a winning strategy in place for both sides. So I don't want people to think that you want to neglect the campus side from our conversations that we've had thus far today. I think there is a route where you're able to get the best of both worlds and straddle that line of having good talent on the NFL and the college side.
You were saying for the Canton side, you're someone that you want to trade those guys before they hit the age cliff. Who are some guys that you feel are approaching that age cliff that you want to move off now before the public realizes?
Gosh, yeah, that is an interesting one. I think that Saquon Barkley could be an interesting example because you have to think of guys who have not already soured. So you throw out Saquon, and even though he was on maybe not the best situation this year, at the end of the day, I don't know that he's going to have that many more years. People don't even realize he's like 27 years old and had a little bit of that injury history to his name. I don't mind in general, though, selling a bunch of running backs. That's not always helpful in these discussions because we know that in general, the Devy and dynasty landscape is not so friendly to the running back position. They don't trust it, and that's very understandable with the history at the running back position. So as far as good guys to trade who haven't already went off that cliff, because I would say it's safe to assume that guys like Derrick Henry, Austin Eckler, you're not getting a whole lot for them these days. So I'm still willing to roster those guys. I think that Eckler could have another solid year. Henry could have another solid year. But some of these other guys where it's like, yeah, Saquon could have a few more years left. I'm willing to sell those guys because you can extract even more of that high-end value. So that'd be one that I would shout out at the running back position. I have to think here on wide receivers, but do you have anybody in particular that you're trying to sell at the running back position on the NFL side?
At the running back side, I would probably. I'm buying Josh Jacobs. He's someone that I'm buying because I think people are really soured on him with, the majority of his career. He's been inefficient, but he had one great season. And I think you can buy low on him. But as far as selling, I I always teeter with Rashad White. I always think Tampa's going to trust him. Even though he's been inefficient, the offensive line hasn't been there, and so it's not really his fault. He's a good receiving back, so he's someone that I've always teetered on. But I think as the time goes on, I think he's more of a sell because I think people really like him. There's probably 3 to 4 managers in every league that really likes him, and I think he's someone that you can sell. And if you do sell, I would sell him before the free agency hits, so that you can get peak value now, so that you don't have to worry about them possibly bringing in like a Austin Eckler, Derrick Henry, something like that. Um, you mentioned Saquon, that was a good one. I would probably sell. I would probably sell Christian McCaffrey.
See that? How about a Kenneth Walker? Like I think that there the injury history and the competition there, and then the changes coaching staff wise or within the organization, and those things start to scare me a little bit. And you see the efficiency, the boom bust tendency,
Yeah.
both from an analytical standpoint, just watching him play, and the fact that he's hasn't really been a workhorse. It doesn't look like he's just about to become the guy who'll get like 90% of the touches. And if he does, he's probably not going to hold up for it. I think that unfortunately, I like Kenneth Walker quite a bit as a player, but when the health starts creeping in, plus those other concerns, I think that he's still very valuable. I think he's like RB8 ish in the landscape in Dynasty, and that could be an interesting one to sell. He's definitely not at that age peak or past that peak. There's still plenty of years that you could get out of him, but what are those years going to look like? Is he going to be a game winning or a league winning asset for you? Um, you mentioned McCaffrey as well. I don't think that's a bad shout out at this point, but another one of those guys like um, Travis Kelce, where you just have him on your team and you have such an edge for years to come. If you don't think you're a contender, then certainly pivot from Christian McCaffrey and go down to a I'm trying to think like Josh Jacobs, like you mentioned, plus get some nice campus assets, maybe
Yeah.
another NFL asset, something like that. But McCaffrey still holds quite a bit of value. So you're right. It's not maybe the worst time to get out from that if you're not confident in your team's ability as well.
I think the Ken Walker call is really good because we have that new coaching staff. We don't really know what's going to happen. Ryan Grubbs. When he was at Washington, we saw what kind of system they kind of ran with Kalen DeBoer there. So there's a real good possibility that it'll still be a 55-45 split with him and Charbonnet. And yeah, Ken Walker, he's had a history of injuries, so I think that is a real good call. And Ken Walker, someone who's young, who's shown flashes, and you can probably get good value for him. Same with a Tyjae Spears. With Derrick Henry leaving, I'm sure there are certain managers that believe he might pick up the majority of those 300 vacated carries. I'm not one of them. I think they'll pick up, someone that's a veteran to kind of help him out. And, you know, we've seen the medicals, where he has no ACL. So he's that ticking time bomb. So he's someone that you can easily sell high right now.
Absolutely. And then even looking at wide receivers, because I know you were interested if I had any guys there that I would sell. I mean, maybe Jalen Waddle. The issue is that he's coming off not maybe the best end to the season, not the best season in general, but then people eye up like, ooh, there's the possibility of Tyreek Hill really declining or just retiring here sometime in the next 1 to 2 seasons. Not this season, but after that, potentially, I guess with Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle just hasn't really been able to consistently put it together and in a large volume role. I think my issue though is that if he's tethered to McDaniels there, they're going to have an efficient offense. They're going to be able to get creative touches to those playmakers like Waddle. I just wonder a little bit of the injury history and the fact that he's never necessarily been an alpha in any situation he's been in. But I mean, you can't blame him too much because he was at Alabama, and then now he's been with Tyreek Hill for at least the last 2 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't feel strongly that Jalen Waddle is a sell, but at the same time, I'm trying to remember what trade I did back this last season, but it was like in the playoffs I really needed a guy, so I was like, oh, I'll move off a um, uh, Jalen Waddle and I'll get a DJ Moore, and then make another player swap with that move, and that ended up netting me a championship just from the fact that Waddle was sitting on my bench, and I was kind of not out of options, but poor options, and you kind of pivot from there. You get DJ Moore, who ended up having a good playoff run. I can't remember if championship week. So at the end of the day, sometimes you got to get creative with these wide receivers. I understand that Waddle is younger than a DJ Moore, so then people love youth right at that
Yeah.
position. But so that's a tough one to advocate selling for. But there are some signs there that make me a bit wary with Waddle.
I think a trade that you can do, and it'll probably have to be done after the NFL draft, is if you have a Brian Thomas Jr., you can possibly trade him for a Chris Olave. And especially if Brian Thomas gets first round draft capital. You know, a lot of times in these C2C leagues, people get really aggressive with these rookies, and they want these rookies. They want these hot young guys. And you might have a manager that has Chris Olave who's been frustrated for the past 2 years. And, if they don't change that quarterback position, you can possibly get out, or you can possibly find that manager who wants to get out on Chris Olave, and you can make that deal one for one. I mean, I don't think that's out of line.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if that's not doable in your league or most leagues right now, you wait till that peak when there's a lot of hype and maybe it materializes that Brian Thomas can go in the late first in the actual NFL draft. And maybe you just add a little bit to get an Olave, who just, I mean, to me, that's the much more appealing asset of the two. So I definitely like that call of targeting Olave. And in general, with these wide receivers, I would say you presented a few different, or at least we're asking for a few different selves. I would say a lot of these guys, it's like, man, might hold the Mike Evans or Amari Cooper we talked about earlier, unless I get the right situation to swap or upgrade elsewhere. But a lot of the time I'm more so like buying specific guys that might really be set up for a great future, like a Garrett Wilson, a Chris Olave. And then I think Brian Thomas Jr. was a great example of a sell, or like an AD Mitchell. Like if I have somebody like that in my league, I'm more likely to want to sell those guys for sure.
If you're having these rookies on your team, on your campus side, getting ready to go to Canton side, I think a lot of questions that people might have is when to trade. When is that timing? Is it right after the draft? Is it in the summer when, camp's going on, you hear buzz? Like for you, when do you want to offload these guys? I mean, it's always good to have communication with, a trade partner and say, hey, what's your feel on this? But if they get that first round capital, are you trying to capitalize then, or are you going to wait until summer when camp hits?
That's always a risk. You wait for Keishon Butte to get great draft capital, and then it doesn't happen. And there's still somewhat of a sell window, but his value takes a hit. And then now it's taking a further hit, right? The signs were kind of there, though I chose to kind of keep ignoring those signs for a while. But no, no, but yeah, do you wait is the question. And I don't pull off a lot of trades this time of year. People go into a little bit of that hibernation or just taking a little bit of a step away time wise. But if you're having consistent dialogue with any of your trade mates at this point in the off season, not a bad idea to start getting that feeling for where they have some of the guys in this class and or some of the assets that you have or vice versa, right? Um, so yeah, I'm not opposed to making a trade coming up here in like March, April, starting as more and more people are starting to get back into like, okay, what kind of moves can I make here after the season's done? So there is that lull period, and a lot of these guys are going to start getting more and more hype, right? Teams hyping them up in preparation for the NFL draft. So I don't know that it's quite time to sell on an AD Mitchell and guys like that, but also I'm not an AD Mitchell guy. So at this point, I might take something desirable, anything I can get almost. I shouldn't say anything I can get, but at current conversations that I'm seeing out there, I'm like, yeah, I'll take those things, any of those assets, mid-tier guys. Like, yeah, I'm trying to acquire Zay Flowers, or I'm trying to acquire like a Chris Godwin or a Stephon Diggs, and maybe those are all no-brainers. But in some circles, they're like, yeah, I love Brian Thomas Jr. I love AD Mitchell, and you go down the list, and maybe it's another situation of Mingo last year. People really did like Mingo, but there were a lot of red flags with the
Yeah.
profile. I was willing to kind of start making those trades of getting him off my roster and acquiring some guys I wanted more so with less risk. And the time that I was trying to make those trades, I want to say was just leading up to the NFL draft, or maybe even after the NFL draft, to be honest, just because nobody was really valuing Mingo quite as highly pre-draft as they were after.
Yeah.
So there is a good point to holding if you think the guy is going to get nice draft capital. Absolutely.
Now, who we were just right now about Jonathan Mingo. Mingo and Michael Wilson. There were two guys that not many people felt would get really good draft capital, but they did. Who is someone in this draft class that you know that the majority of people aren't thinking about, but someone that might rise up in the process and get that good draft capital?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's like always that like that riser, where do they come from? Where how high do they end up going? And off the top of my head, I'm trying to think. I don't have my rookie rankings all solidified quite yet as well. So kind of parsing that out, I'm trying to think. Like Troy Franklin is already pretty high out there. I don't necessarily see a lot of room for him to grow and skyrocket up those rankings right now in this class. And we've seen some guys even lately kind of lose a little bit of that luster, like a Devontae
Yeah.
Walker, and a lot of Senior Bowl guys actually lose value. So it's like, who is going to rise up? I think you're going to see a lot of Lad McConkey out there, Roman Wilson rise up there. I don't know that I'm a staunch believer in either of those guys. So that could be something you consider. Like, do you sell premature is the question, because those guys could garner some nice draft capital, probably day two, a minimum at this point. So those guys I could certainly see gaining some value at this time. So if you want to play that value game, try to acquire them before they make that jump. It's not bad. How about you? Any particular guys, it could be wide receivers or otherwise, that you're kind of eyeing up that are going to make some fairly decent jumps here in value?
I think two wide receivers will. I think Ricky Pearsall, I think he'll make a jump. And I think Jalen Polk, I think he'll make a jump. And then for the running back, I had an article come out the week before the Senior Bowl where I said Jalen Wright, he is my sleeper running back of the class. And then, like a couple weeks later, a lot of other people came out with the same thing, so he might not be a sleeper anymore. But I think those three guys. I think if I had to pick guys that are going to make a jump, it would be them. I think Polk can. I think he's a second round pick. Um, I think with Pearsall, possibly a third rounder. I think Jalen Wright, I think he has every chance to be the third or fourth running back taken off the board.
People will be really excited about Jalen Wright's speed and how he tests, most likely. And that's going to be interesting at that size. So I really like that call. He's been a guy that I've been a fan of for a long time. So it's great to hear you say that you're the same. And I would say that, yeah, the wide receiver shout outs, I think that those guys are also potential risers. So I said Roman Wilson, McConkey, and then with your couple of guys that you threw out there, that's very valid. Pearsall is another one that, I kind of don't really know what to do with him. I'm not maybe the highest, but I mean, if he is getting that day two draft capital potentially, that is very interesting to say. Well, you just want to hold on to him and sell at that point once he gets that value and maybe starts going higher and higher in rookie drafts and just in valuation in general. So, yeah, I would say actually, the more that we're talking about it, these guys, you might just want to hold on to them. The running back position is a little bit different because there's lots of guys vying for that. But this year, there's not clear studs. There's not clear like safe guys. And at this point, I might just be willing to sell now on them before they get into a landing spot and really crater in value. So as much as I like a Marshawn Lloyd in this class, like I think he's going to continue to rise. He's pretty high for most people already. But at this point, you just don't really know what's going to present itself with the combine, with the NFL draft and landing spot, etc. Kind of risky with some of these running backs versus there is some value at this point to staying put on the wide receivers because there's going to be a lot of them drafted in the NFL draft on day one and day two combined.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that because I mean we've seen on X where some people have Marshawn Lloyd as their RB1, some people have Blake Corum in the top three, some people have Bucky Irving as a running back one. It's all over the place. You know, a lot of people have Braylon Allen as the running back one, Jonathan Brooks as their running back one. So it is all over the place. And if you have that believer, yeah, sell high because it's quite possible that no running back gets taken until the third round. That is a legit possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said it well. And I guess anything could happen this year with the running backs, but I'm not strongly banging the table for any one of them as like a high end type of guy. There's certainly sleepers, and I do like the call that you had there with Jalen Wright out of Tennessee.
Now, do you have any final words as far as the C2C trading approach goes for everyone?
No, just in general, I like having that dialogue with folks and trying to establish good rapport. I like the point that you brought up earlier about being first to market. I think that was valid, absolutely, or at least first to like start inquiring and doing all those things. But in general, I've found just being active makes a lot of it makes a huge difference in the outcome of your teams and the outcome of the success, both short and long term. So paying attention to news is huge. We didn't necessarily say that already, but I would say that's just a huge thing. That's not that hard to do. Is just try to follow the right people on X or Twitter and other sources that you like to utilize, like those. Whether it's a site, I'm a contributor at Campus to Canton, so and there's just so many great resources out there. So I would definitely recommend people follow you. People follow all the people who are linked in this industry and evaluating some of these changes going on, because as we said earlier, values can change really fast, and it's nice to see some of that coming with spring camp news and everything coming up here. So stay linked into people, stay communicating with league mates, stay ahead of the curve as far as getting some trades maybe or some offers out there at least. So those are some good ideas for folks.
Perfect. Now we have reached to the point where we have our profile segment. Now each week we'll do a Devy player profile, get you ready for 2024 rookie drafts. We also do a CFF player profile to get you ready for those, CFF and C2C sub drafts. And we also give you an under the radar freshman player profile. Now for this week, the Devy Digest player profile of the day is Texas running back Jonathan Brooks. He is 6 foot, 207 pounds, 20 years old. He is a three-down back. He does have soft hands as a receiver. He has good vision, quick acceleration and burst, and he is a one cut and go runner. Now, with him having that torn ACL, we are getting a discount in the NFL draft and for the rookie draft values. So he is someone that you should consider in your drafts. Now, the CFF player profile of the day is South Carolina wide receiver Jared Brown. He is 6 foot, 190 pounds, began his career at Coastal Carolina. He is a quick, twitchy athlete. This past season, 93% in the slot. So he is someone that's going to be using that short area to kind of create in space. He should be that safety blanket for their new quarterback, Lenoris Sellers. So he is someone to take a look if he hasn't been picked up in your C2C leagues. Now, the under the radar freshman player profile of the day is Virginia Tech wide receiver Keelan Adams. He is 6'2", 180 pounds, a 4-star in the composites, as high as wide receiver 24, and as low as being unranked in the composites. Now, he averages out to be wide receiver 42, and he's my wide receiver 32 for the 2024 freshman class. Now, what he does well is he tracks the ball very well. He has strong hands, a smooth route runner. He is a fluid athlete. And he does have a lot of short area kind of push passes in his profile that he can get on the field right away. So he does have that pathway. He can earn those manufactured touches and those snaps in the slot where they give him the ball. So he is someone to look for in your C2C and possibly Devy drafts, but more than likely the later rounds of those C2C sub drafts. Now, Aaron, I appreciate you coming aboard. You're saying that you're doing work with Campus to Canton and everything. Where can people find you on X, and what are you currently working on?
Yes, currently I'm working on the Devy guide at Campus to Canton. So doing all those player profiles. I'm also working on rankings. I'm just continuing to update those now. So some Devy specific ones and some other ones on their site as well now. So I would certainly check out the website, check out them. And I also do a Devy podcast as well, a Devy devotional podcast with my podcast co-host, John at Dynasty Coach A on Twitter as well. So we like to do that every other week on average for our podcasting, and it's just so fun to be able to come on here today too. I really appreciate this. You're doing great work here at Devy Digest, and it was just a blast, honestly.
I appreciate the kind words. And everyone, go follow Aaron at Aaron Wilcox 86. Now, if you've enjoyed this show, I do some other content as well. Now, for the audio and video shows that we do, every Sunday and Wednesday, we do the Devy Digest show through league winners. They air on Spotify and Apple every Monday and Thursday. Myself, Nino Brown, S.E. Romero, we do the Future Phenoms through league winners. That's every Monday. And then Tuesdays, we do Welcome to the Big House through the CFB Nation. They air the next day on Spotify and Apple, which would typically be on Wednesday. For my written content, you can find them through the league winners. Every Monday, we do a 2024 Devy Digest player profile. Get you ready for the rookie drafts that you have coming up. Every Friday, we do the Devy Digest Freshman Friday player profile. Wednesdays and Saturdays, we do content on Utah, Utah State, and BYU football. Get you ready for spring camp and to bring you some exclusive behind the scenes content. Now, we'll be back next time, but before we go, if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, comment, subscribe. You can follow me at Andy_fam1. And if you're listening on Spotify and Apple, give us a rate and review. And we'll see you next time on the Devy Digest.